Hi, everyone. We'll just be starting in just a minute.
Good afternoon. I'm Graham Wilson, Director of the Boston University Initiative on Cities. I'm so glad you can join us for this discussion of the future of downtowns. If you venture into central Boston, or for that matter, central London, Paris, or New York, the question you'll probably ask is, where are all the people? Our downtowns have been emptied by COVID. Office workers are, like us, perched over their laptops on Zoom rather than thronging the streets around major office buildings. We're almost nostalgic for the days when I-93 was a parking lot. The question we face is whether those missing people will be back, or more plausibly, what proportion of them will be back. This matters hugely, not only to the owners of office buildings, but to the small businesses from food trucks to shoe repair and hairdressers who depend on those people for their income. The apocalyptic view is that the crowds are not returning. Employers have discovered that it's far cheaper to have people work from their dining room table at home than in high-priced offices. The optimistic view is that, well, that people work better when they're together and they'll be back. If not, maybe we'll find alternative uses for those big office buildings. We've got a great panel to discuss these and related questions. Its members are, first, Brian Swett, Principal Boston Office Leader and Director of Cities in the Americas for the Global Engineering and Design Corporation, Arup. Brian is a long-standing friend of the Initiative on Cities and has long experience of dealing with urban challenges in government as well as the private sector. Emily Keyes-Innes has over 10 years of experience in planning and urban design. Previously Director of Urban Planning and Design at Harriman Associates, she created Innes Associates in 2020. She's been project manager or director for over 55 projects for cities and communities, including downtown revitalization projects. And we thank her for her service to Boston University by serving on the advisory board for city planning and urban affairs. David Valichelos is Director of Design, North Shore Community Development Coalition, an award-winning urban planner and real estate developer. He's passionate about connecting people, buildings, and public space. He's one of the founders and the director of the Punto Urban Art Museum, a social justice and art program in the Point neighborhood. I'm glad to say that he's a terrier, a holder of a master's in city planning from Boston University. And the panel will be moderated by John Chesto, whose truly insightful stories on business and politics in the Boston Globe will be known to all of you. Before joining the Globe, John was managing editor at the Boston Business Journal and business editor at the Patriot Ledger in Quincy, winning several national awards for his work. His stories on the future of downtown inspired this seminar. John, thank you so much, and over to you, with just a request from me to the audience to use the Q&A feature, not chat, to pose questions to the panel. John, thanks so much for doing this, and over to you.
Thanks, Graham, for that great introduction, and thanks to BU for hosting this panel. I'm really interested to hear what the panelists have to say. Like you, Graham, I went into downtown once on a weekday last October to swap out my keyboard at the Boston Globe, and it was alarming to say the least. I felt like I'd walked into a post-apocalyptic version of downtown Boston. I think I saw maybe 3 people between South Station and the Globe's office, which is about a half-mile walk, when normally I would see a few hundred. And those 3 people, I think, were all construction workers at the Winthrop Square Tower. So it's easy to wonder what this means once the pandemic's finally over. I think all of us are going to be rushing back, but I am hopeful that we will start to see crowds downtown again. From what I can tell from the morning traffic reports, it is picking up a bit. So I want to hear sort of the perspective from our three panelists before we get into some of the questions that some of the people who are tuning in have, and my own questions. I want to hear sort of what their take is, just in general, from their job, their perspective on the future of cities, what they're hearing through their work. And maybe we could start with Brian on that. Brian, what are you hearing from your, I mean, I'm sure you're interacting with people who are doing development in cities all the time right now. What's the prognosis?
Yeah, I think it's clearly the question of the day as we see a light at the end of the tunnel to a return to a different version of normal. And I think the question is, what is going to be that balance of uses in a downtown, and how quickly folks are going to want to meet that pent up demand for social interaction. So I think, after the year plus that we've been through, I think there is a sincere desire to interact more with our colleagues, but not necessarily a return back to full-fledged normal, as there are benefits to to partial work from home. I think in my mind, I think a couple of lessons learned from the Boston area, and we're seeing these experiences in other cities. One is that the neighborhoods in the downtown that have been more resilient in this dramatic period of a reduction in sort of commuter-driven traffic are those that were inherently further along in progress to sort of a walkable urbanity, with a mix of uses, a density of desires to be in the neighborhood, be they because you're a resident, because you're there for retail reasons, you're there for a job reason, and those neighborhoods that had this space to take over aspects of their public realm that were devoted to parking uses were able to get outside their walls. And I think neighborhoods like the South End and the downtown, walking through that, and I happen to live in the South End. It's a different use, but the activation is very high relative to the experience in downtown Crossing. And I think what we've seen from a silver lining perspective is that we can use our outdoor spaces in our public realms and reduce some of the areas that we had devoted to parking and logistics significantly, and increase the diversity of uses and sort of the enjoyment. So I tend to bear on the side of optimism of a return to a different scale of activation downtown, but also hopefully a renewed prioritization for making sure that we have truly live, work, and play in the same locations. And we're sort of living up to that mantra of mixed use development, because I think those areas that had actually embraced that in their development profiles over the last couple of decades have been the most resilient in the last year. And those that were really commercially driven, and businesses that were dependent on 90% commercial traffic or the lunch crowd, really suffered, and that was a major challenge. And I think hopefully we will learn the positive lessons learned from this and return to active and vibrant cities and a different type of use of the massive amount of sidewalk space and of asphalt and road space that we have in our cities to be more human-centered and people-oriented.
Thanks, Brian. What about you, Emily? What's your take? What are you seeing?
I think in many ways, very similar to what Brian's seeing, but just to call out a couple of points. One is that idea of diversification of uses within neighborhoods, within downtowns. I think that's really important. And with that, I would also add maybe a little bit of regional diversification, because if we're going back to a situation in Boston or the larger cities where office workers are there maybe 2 days a week, 3 days a week, I think that gives some advantages to some of the smaller communities that I've been working with during the pandemic of, well, if they're home 2 or 3 days a week, can we build on some of the uses in the smaller downtowns to capture some of that energy? Maybe there's some third places for them to work in a suburb before they go back to the city. And then that really begs the question of of why are you going back into a larger office? And I think that has implications for some of the space needs that I'm sure we'll talk about later in the conversation. I think too that when we've been thinking about going back to work in the big city, as it were, we've principally been focused on those office workers who have emptied out from the downtown. But it's an important thing to remember that there are people who never left the downtown. So while we were sitting in our homes working, there were people cleaning the offices. There were people driving the buses or the trains that got them to those jobs. There were, at least for a while until everything really shut down, there were people trying to keep up with the retail or the restaurant, and then finding, as Graham mentioned at the beginning, that those aren't supportable if you don't have people in the offices. So figuring out how we build a future city that takes into account all of the users of the space is going to be really important.
David, you have a good, like, I would say, a front row seat on how some of the smaller cities might be adapting to this new world. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing?
Yeah, and I think first I just wanted to thank the Initiative on Cities for hosting this and for having me on board. But it has been interesting because I think the rebound, or I guess where some people have looked to other communities that have like historic cores, such as Salem, we have seen maybe like a boom in people that are looking for bigger spaces and but at a lower cost. So a lot of people, like the housing market and these outer communities, have actually started seeing an increase in housing prices, an increase for housing demand. But it's always looking not to sacrifice the urban living, but actually to benefit from it just at a lower cost. So it has been interesting to see that outside of Greater Boston. And another thing, of course, like the public health crisis is just affecting everyone. And one of the things I believe when we see global or regional crisis like this is that it highlights our inefficiencies in the system and our inequalities. So who has been affected the most? Like people have been going to downtown, but some people also like don't have the access to the internet to work from home, or are crowded more in smaller spaces. So that's one thing that I have seen as I've been working in low-income communities, that the difference between the one that could go home and work from home, but then also the one that was not allowed, being able to do that. So, and what is the ripple effect of that? So it has been very interesting to witness that, so.
Great, I think that's a good segue into a question that we received. What kind of recovery do you think Boston will have from the pandemic as compared to smaller cities? And you know, I know we're all sort of in the Boston orbit, but I'm also curious what your take is on smaller cities that aren't sort of near a big employment hub like Boston. You know, will they thrive or will they suffer once we get out of the pandemic? Or maybe we can start with David on that one.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, to talk about cities like Boston, then we'll have to talk about a global economy, right? And so when we think of investment and like housing demand or rebound, then Boston, I think on its own, it's strong because of the economy that it has, that it's dependent upon universities or healthcare institutions that are gonna go nowhere. So I'm confident that there is Boston is gonna come out stronger. I do think that it's the time for bold action from city officials. I do think that like there are like some actions that we saw that there were no-brainers. Like for example, it took a global pandemic to figure out that parklets could be put all across the North End, and that should not have taken that global pandemic. You know, Newberry Street can be more pedestrian oriented. We see like now everyone is crowded, and then you're like almost like hitting against each other on shoulders on the sidewalks because everyone wants to be outside. So I think it is a multifaceted approach, but I think it requires bold actions from city officials. And I think we have seen some of that, but I would like to see more. And I think in terms of the global economy, I think what we're seeing is a little bit of a ripple effect that some people now that can work online or via the internet, they can also relocate to smaller cities where they can afford the extra 200 square feet to have their own private office there. So as they have to deal with childcare or, so I think there's win and loses, but I think there might be a benefit also for smaller cities as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially in terms of thinking about space. So, you know, one of the things we saw was this flight, still seeing it in our housing market, this flight to larger spaces so that people could have two separate offices in the house, kids could learn from home. And I think the flexibility of housing is going to continue to be a topic of conversation, whether it is the ability to work from home more frequently and have space for family life as well. So you're not juggling multiple uses on the dining room table, but also stretching that to multi-generational living. I know of quite a few people who looked at the crisis in the nursing homes, for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, and, you know, are rethinking perhaps where they live as they age and how they manage their spaces for that. So I think there's a knock-on effect from how people live to where they live. And to David's point, I think that opens up a lot of opportunities for smaller cities to really focus on the quality of life. But I think that also needs to come paired with improvements in broadband access, because out of the Boston metro region, there are certainly plenty of places that have challenges with that. There are other infrastructure challenges, and primarily among that is going to be transportation. And so making sure that we have a strong regional network of transport, whether it's bus, train, light rail, however those complexes work or those systems work, that's a conversation that needs to stretch well beyond Boston's borders. And that's what's going to make a successful region and state recovery and not just a successful Boston recovery.
Brian, what's your take in terms of sort of the different cities and how they recover?
Yeah, and I think in Massachusetts in particular, John, the potential for significant lasting change is particularly significant because Massachusetts had a historically low percentage of folks who were working from home pre-pandemic, right? So traditionally, Massachusetts had clusters of employment and lots of bedroom communities and commuter communities, and that was, you know, that's how we've developed our city and reinforced that in our urban cores for decades. And now when you look at the studies across all different types of employment where there is flexibility of where you can locate, significant percentages of those employees want to work for multiple days a week from home. And so I think there's both, how does that change the downtown cores that were dependent on, you know, 5 days, you know, 9 to 5 of those workers being there. But the other side of that is, how does it change the bedroom communities, right? You now have folks, you know, I walk around my neighborhood looking for lunch, working from home very differently, whereas I was walking around downtown around my office looking for lunch, you know, previously. And so there's a different dynamic and a vitality potential for a whole lot of, you know, the traditional suburban and exurban communities of Massachusetts from this new demand for activation during weekday daylight hours. So I think that's the interesting dynamic, and I'm fully confident that Boston, you know, and the downtown commercial centers will evolve to support increased activation. I think the trajectories were there, right? If you look at the reactivation of arts and culture and theater, and, you know, different ways of using outdoor space, the investments in parks and open space, we were beginning to do that in Boston over the last 10 or 20 years. I think that just accelerates, and to create more reasons for folks to now come into the city at night, right? And I think there's this mentality, right? If you're commuting in for work, then when you go home, you want to be home. But if you're working from home, maybe you are more likely to go in on a Wednesday night into the city to catch a concert, right? Or to go, you know, on a waterfront tour. So I think the whole dynamic of the region of how we live, work, and play, you know, is going to change, and could change in very positive ways from a post-pandemic perspective.
Emily, you raised the point about infrastructure investment. I was wondering if the panel could kind of further address this. You know, one of the big things that we're facing here is trying to figure out how much traffic we're going to see on the MBTA post-pandemic and how to plan for that. And obviously there were a number of capital projects the MBTA had prior to the pandemic, and whether those are necessary or whether those should be rethought or re-envisioned. that those are questions that are being asked now. Emily, I'm curious, maybe you could start us off. Maybe you could expand a little on what kind of infrastructure investments you think need to be done, or at least what are sort of the questions that need to be answered as policy leaders decide. And obviously you mentioned transportation. There's also broadband's another important infrastructure investment that may have been overlooked in the past. Maybe you could expand a little on that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So in one of the communities that I worked with during this period, it was a smaller community out in central Massachusetts, and we were actually finishing up a comprehensive plan right when the pandemic hit. So you better believe I was rewriting this plan on the fly, trying to anticipate with the client what would happen. And they called me up one day and they said, look, we need to talk about broadband, because it's not enough just to get broadband into the community. That's the start, right? The finish is, how do we get it to people's homes, and then how do we get it to people who haven't had access in the past, whether it's low income or elderly? How do we get them the devices? How do we get them the training? How do we make it so that people in central Massachusetts can work anywhere they like, can communicate with each other? And what they were seeing was they were able to communicate with some people in their town very well, but others were just not getting reached in a period we all went virtually. So I think part of it is, how do we get high-speed broadband to everybody? And then what does getting it to everybody actually mean? Just having the physical infrastructure there isn't enough. So, I thought that was incredibly valuable insight from somebody who was working with that on the ground. I would say in terms of public transit, we need to get comfortable with being back on public transportation again. And I think some of that's going to come naturally as vaccinations become more widespread, as we get more used to it. But it also needs to be an investment in, how do we make public transit as convenient, or as convenient as you can get as having a car? How do we address the last mile part? So the number of smaller communities I'm working in, where you get to the train station, that's great, but you still have to get from the train station to somewhere else. So I've been talking with a couple of communities about, do you have a local shuttle that can get people from Boston to your community and then out to the assets that you have in your community that you're driving people? Is it pedestrian connections? Is it bicycle connections? What can we do to reduce regional traffic by focusing on regional investments in overall transportation, but also that last mile transportation? I think that's going to be a huge question. I think it's also an opportunity to address something that's really gone hand in hand with the pandemic, which is climate change. So, I'm sure our collective carbon footprint tanked March through June or even later, depending on personal circumstances of last year. It's going to go back up again. How can we take some of that opportunity and apply those lessons to what we're doing now?
Brian, what's your take on sort of the infrastructure improvements that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think a couple items. I think one, just to reiterate Emily's take on this, I think that last mile mobility and doing it in a climate friendly and healthy way, there's some really encouraging signs. There's some recent studies coming out of Europe in the last couple of weeks looking at, taking advantage of some of that reduced traffic to put in additional bike infrastructure and bike lanes, and seeing causal relationships between adding that infrastructure, actually encouraging folks to then venture out and become cyclists. And I think you saw in the downtown Boston, the city, take advantage of some of these times to put in lanes, to takeaway parking and put in bike lanes that are now becoming highly used. So I think rethinking that mobility question, I think even a significant work from home trend in the work from home environment in Massachusetts is not going to solve our highway congestion, right? So to think that this buys us, a decade of we can breathe. No, it's still about investing in transit and rail and bus networks and BRT. and potentially in a different way, because maybe it's not as commuter driven now, right? Maybe it's not the commuter hours out of the peaks, but it's spread out over a longer period of time. Maybe you have more folks working reduced hours in the office and working more at home. And so, we spread out that time and there's less peak demand, which could actually be a good thing, spread out the same demand over longer periods of time from a transit and rail perspective. So I think the challenging part for us, and you've seen the state begin some studies on work from home, you've seen MassDOT look at its numbers again, and how do we correctly model for telecommuting, we are in a period of time where we know we're not going back to the same percentages previously in terms of folks working from home. We don't know exactly where we're going to wind up at a time where I think a lot of us are optimistic that we'll be making historically large investments in mass transit and infrastructure, going forward if some version of the Biden infrastructure bill passes. So how do we make sure we're investing in it with the flexibility to be dynamic and responsive to changing user patterns? Right. And I think clearly it's more on rail and biking and transit. But how do we make sure we've designed the system to be more adaptable than the system that we put in place in the 20th century, which proved that context of, if you build it, development patterns will progress around the decisions around rail and bus. And we need to be much more conscious around how we do that today to create a real equitable and socially vibrant and economically resilient entire state, right? Instead of having cities and towns benefit and other cities and towns become bedroom communities.
Great, David. What are your thoughts on the infrastructure improvements we need to be making?
Yeah, no, I think going back to Emily, I think broadband, it's a huge one. I mean, from the lenses of social justice and equity, that is a big one. Many of the neighborhoods where we work, we kind of like partnered up with the public school systems, and we mapped out where those kind of like lack of service was, and where the kids were not reporting to go to school because they were doing it online, and you could see the clusters, right? So I think broadband should be a priority, especially just for economic development in general, like this whole competition with 5G for the US, that should be a huge investment there. In terms of, and going back to like the South End and the 15 kind of like minute neighborhood living where you find all your basic amenities, I think kind of like this multimodal mobility, like of course how you connect to train, but bikes and walking, but the challenge I think with the US, it's kind of like this cultural shift from going from the individual to the collective a little bit in terms of commuting. And I think there was almost a line that I thought Emily was going to finish the way that I thought, but she probably finished better. But it's like, how do we make transit cool again? You might like, it's like, how do we make like taking the bus cool again? And we have decades of policy making for 40 years, focusing only on the car and how to benefit the car and the highway. That is like, how do we shift that paradigm so that like when you go out, you go and you take the bus, you take the train, and it's cool and it's nice, and that's how you see your friends and stuff like that. So I think there is like this cultural shift as well that we need as a society, that it will be interesting as we do the investments, we'll also shift that cultural perspective as well.
One of the conversations, just to jump on that I had with a community recently, actually, it was our class, David, that idea of people being able to go out to the community that we're working in, go to this wonderful restaurant, but then instead of driving out there, they're taking the train, they're taking a shuttle to the restaurant, they're taking the shuttle back to the train and the train home. You've just taken, people off the road. So you've got the cars off the road. People are able to enjoy themselves at the restaurant without having to worry about one person not having the glass of wine because they're the designated driver. And you've made it cool, right? It's that night out with your friends. You're all going to go to this great new place together. And, that's the real vision for what we could see happening.
It's interesting you pointed out, speaking personally, given the way the commuter rail structures, I live on the commuter rail, given the way the old schedules worked, it was almost impossible to use it to go out. Pretty much, if I wanted to go out in Boston, I had to stick around from my day job at the Globe and then take the train back. You could not take a train in after a certain hour. Now I know the MBTA is working to sort of do more regional rails. They're nicknamed for sort of having trains that run throughout the day rather than at many at rush hour, to have a more even flow of traffic. I wonder, that seems like a great idea, but I wonder, how effective it'll be if we do get a crush of rush hour people again, whether they'll be able to accommodate that. I've got one fewer departure now at rush hour. Maybe I will be able to go out at night now. I haven't looked at the evening schedules because I haven't thought about going out in a long time, but it's a tricky balance. There's a reason why the trains have sort of gravitated, train schedules gravitated around rush hour. It kind of makes me wonder if the panelists have any thoughts about whether we'll see shifts. We'll see. Will it be 9 to 5 for the people who come back, or do you think there'll be, do you think it'll be different times of the day or night? A lot of it, of course, is built around when kids go to school too. What kind of shifts do you think we'll see in sort of the workday, or is it more going to be just shifts on, how many people are leaving the house versus working from home? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess I can start. From my perspective, we built a transportation and a transit system, in particular, commuter rail systems, to serve a particular user at a particular time, right? And inherently, heavy rail is relatively inflexible. So if you're talking about an engine and a couple of cars going down a line, there's a pent up cost and resources for doing that. I think we're getting more nimble in thinking about how do we use our fixed rail assets differently, right? And I think anybody who's been to a European city understands that. And obviously, there's a density of urbanity in Europe that is more significant than in the U.S. But they're able to use their fixed rail infrastructure differently to serve multiple purposes, throughout a 24/7 period. And so I think we're beginning to rethink that and think about what are the trips that people want to make. And it's a bit of a chicken and the egg, because again, I'd go back to my earlier comment. I'm much more, and I think many people are, if I am barely leaving the house to work, then I want to get out for other reasons during the week, right? I'm going to want to go into the city. I'm going to want to go somewhere else to see a show. I'm going to be willing to go half an hour, outside of my house by train to go get a meal because I haven't left my house to work. Right. And there's that, so you still have that ability to disconnect, that desire, right, to separate work from pleasure and experiences. And so I think we're at the early stages of understanding what that could be. But my hope is that we wind up with, as a region and a state, that is far more exploratory all the time. And it's not just about, where do we go on a weekend, right? But it's about, okay, Tuesday and Wednesday I'm working from home. So those are actually the nights that I want to go out to dinner in some other town. And I'm going to get my babysitter that night. And so I think that, to me, is, this is an opportunity for our region to get much more dynamic and less structured about when we're working, when we're playing, when we're visiting each other.
Yeah, and I would add to that, one of the things that is sometimes problematic about our current transportation system is that as all rail leads to Boston, right? So if you want to travel between communities, it's much trickier. And in some cases, the bus system doesn't necessarily, in some of our communities, doesn't necessarily connect to the rail stations. I'm thinking of one in particular down on the South Shore, where there's a bus that gets within a 10 to 15 minute walk of the rail station and moves on in another direction. And you're thinking for, the short loop where you could just go up and connect that, and maybe now you're connecting at a more regional basis. I also think that Europe gives us an excellent model in terms of how frequently the trains run. So I used to live in Scotland, and there is usually a train pretty much every hour between Edinburgh and Glasgow. And stopping off at 2 sets of trains, one that was express, maybe it had 4 or 5 stops between the 2 communities, and one was the long meandering local that hit every single one of the communities, which I took by accident once and was fascinating, but didn't get me there within the hour. But the point is, they were all connected on a regular basis, and we don't see that. We have too much of the hub and spoke and not enough of the circles between the communities. And thinking about our transportation system that way would be really helpful for that ability to jump over to the next town or 2 towns over after work, as Brian suggested, for that meal in that great restaurant you just heard about.
David, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think just to add, the question of 9 to 5, I think also there's might be a flexibility where it's maybe you just go into the office 2 or 3 days a week instead of the other one. Maybe the normal commuting times of 9 to 5 remains because of school or other factors, but then you're not going in the city 5 days a week or into work 5 days a week. And going back to which I love the positive perspective, Brian, if you're staying at home, then you will have a need to go out during lunch break because you have always stayed at home. And I think then my hope is that there will be a demand for there to be multiple centers within a city or a region, so that it's not only like all trains lead to Rome, right? All trains lead to Boston, but it's more like there will be multiple centers. So we're thinking, instead of energizing just one core, there might be different energies focused elsewhere. And I think that's a great thing too.
We're getting a lot of great questions from the audience, so I'm going to try to merge a couple of them. One concern that has come up repeatedly is sort of, what does this mean for the occupants of the real estate, both in terms of the retail and restaurant on the ground floor in downtowns and the offices above? What's sort of your, I'm just curious to the panelists view in terms of urban downtowns and what needs to be done to ensure the restaurants and stores are still there, or is there anything that can be done once we're out of this pandemic? And do we see conversions of offices, specifically Boston, office space to housing, office space to labs? There are obviously some logistical issues with doing so, even though there is demand for housing and labs more so than for offices right now. So I don't know, maybe we could start with Brian. What are your, it's kind of a umbrella question. If you want to kind of grab and answer what you can, that would be great.
All right, I'll try to grab two of the bigger segments. I think on the conversion of spaces, I think it's been interesting in Boston. I mean, clearly there's a significant and increasing demand for lab and science space. And I think there are big question marks in the office environment. I think in general, in our experience, conversion from office to lab is easier to accomplish than office to residential. Right? A residential, high-rise multifamily building is just inherently different from a logistical standpoint. And if you haven't put in the infrastructure at day one to allow for that conversion, and there are some that that do that, in particular in Europe, then it's very expensive to sort of convert office to housing after it's built. Lab is, usually the value is there on rent where you can justify that potentially. I do think the question becomes who's coming in and for what purpose, right? And so I think what we're seeing amongst our tenants and clients and in conversations with our collaborator architects is that if folks, if you break it down roughly into people have focus time at work and they have collaboration time, the focus time is what can more easily happen at home. And the collaboration time, the in-person, that's still a challenge, even for all of our technology, getting around a table and hashing something out on a whiteboard or on a massive computer screen that is, wall wide, that has a lot of value. And so I think it's about how we design those spaces downtown in those office buildings that are more collaboration purposes. So I think you're going to see less, designated desks, less offices, more multimedia rooms, more inherently sort of mixed-use collaboration spaces. So it's a different type of use, but I think actually it's a more valuable use from sort of an owner and landlord perspective. I do think to your question on the retail at the ground level, that's a longer challenge to solve in the sense that if you had a retail business or a restaurant and 90% of your revenue was from the lunchtime crowd, that's a challenge, right? I'm not sure when or if those populations come back to justify that type of a business model. I think what we need to do as a city is support as much as possible converting those uses, to a breakfast, lunch, and dinner crowd, right? Into a retail and helping drive activation, drive activity, bring folks into our cities for concerts, for events, and allow a rethinking of our public realm. And I think one of the benefits that happened, is traditionally Boston, and this is speaking as a former, city of Boston official, we were not the most flexible at allowing folks to take over sidewalks, let alone parking spaces, right? And it turned out, during the pandemic, we were taking over entire streets There were streets in the South End that we closed to traffic and allowed restaurants to spill out into entirely, and did not disrupt local residential traffic at all. And no one was up in arms about it. And it created a, European style piazzas where folks are out having lunch, 10 months out of the year, with heat lamps, that created this activation that I think would have been unheard of, right, from a planning perspective if we'd proposed it pre-pandemic. And so I think my hope is that we can quickly pivot those areas of downtowns that had been so dependent on that commuter lunch to say, how do we drive the foot traffic for breakfast, lunch, dinner, after hours, drinks, that spreads out that density, and brings, vitality to traditional, office-driven locales. And I'm not saying it'll be easy, but I'm saying, in the certain neighborhoods that worked, there are lessons to be learned that we can replicate in the other downtown neighborhoods.
Emily, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the opportunity that we had during this dreadful period was the fact that we were forced to be flexible, and we were forced to try things that we hadn't really tried before and look to other parts of the world for models, and agree on the collaborative thing. I think the two things that everybody I've talked to has missed most. One is that in-person collaboration, and the other is for people who had school-age children at home. They were so thrilled the first day they were able to go back to the office. Not that they didn't love their children, but the ability to focus when kids are also at home, also trying to learn, made things very difficult. Now that will obviously change as schools reopen full-time. But it does beg the question, if you're going into the office for collaboration, then staying on to have drinks together after work, or have dinner together after work, or taking over a space to have that lunch in between times. I think it goes back to what I said about diversification, thinking about what that diversity of uses is on the ground floor level that supports not just the office crowd, as Brian said, but other people coming in. I think too that retail has actually been a problem for quite some time. So, we've all gotten really used to, over the last year, of being able to, depending on income levels and ability, to get a lot of things delivered to our houses. And I've certainly talked to people who are like, I love this delivery thing. I can have my groceries delivered. This is fantastic. That spells even more trouble for retail, that idea of convenience. It also spells additional trouble for the traffic on our roads, delivering all of those things to our homes rather than to a centralized place. But I think if we can start to think about the activation of ground floor spaces beyond just retail and restaurant, some place like Boston, that's going to work out well, especially in our clusters of areas already devoted to retail and restaurant, right? Newbury Street, Downtown Crossing, there's always going to be a history there. When you start moving out into the smaller cities, I think clustering certain types of activities together, and then, as Brian pointed out, linking that to open space and great open spaces and a mix of scales, so that you're getting the activity not just in the buildings but actually on the street, is going to make a huge difference to how we perceive these things. And it's important to remember that the lessons we're learning now over the next few decades, this is unlikely to be the only pandemic. So what can we learn from this to make us more resilient in terms of those outdoor spaces and use of them going forward?
David, what are your thoughts on sort of the use of these spaces, these ground floor spaces, and/or office space conversions?
Well, I think when we think of downtown and then being vacant and restaurants, depending on the lunch crowd, it's like this multifaceted approach that we have been talking about of like different uses, right? And where are the opportunities to also bring people that are not just going to come in here for the office? And as it was clear that office spaces were starting to be vacant because of the pandemic, I started like reading back and like, what can we learn from past lessons? And one example that I came across was Detroit. After the financial crisis in 2009, there was a lot of adaptive reuse from commercial space to residential. It does come with a lot of it depends on the building, but I mean, depending on the floor plate, and it can be done. Also, another option is like when you have a lot of tall buildings that have different shafts of elevators, where like the first 20 one set of elevators go there, and then the higher ones allows for multiple uses. So you can have a hotel, you can have offices, So how do we start achieving that mix of uses so that the neighborhood is not a 8 to 5 neighborhood that we call it, but more of like almost a 24-hour or you know, 7 to 10 p.m. Kind of neighborhood, and that is kind of required. So how do we achieve that? And of course, the investment on the public realm is crucial. So because it's not the first pandemic that is going to come around, right? So yeah.
We just got a great question about investment in parks. I'm sure Brian can talk a little bit about his experience with the city of Boston. You know, there's sort of, at least before the pandemic, there was this thought that, you know, there's this growing thought that parks should pay for themselves in terms of new parks. And I've covered the Lawn on D saga, which you know, was considered a widely successful park adjoining our big convention center. But the question was, should it be subsidized by the convention center authority, or should it, you know, have private events that could at the park that could pay for the, you know, the occasional public event there? I'm curious what your thoughts are. I mean, it seems like the understanding and appreciation for public open spaces obviously increased or was accentuated during the pandemic. But I'd like to hear, maybe we could start with Brian again on this one and go around the panel. Like, what sort of are the solutions looking forward? How should we approach parks and open spaces in cities? You know, many cities are already built out, like Boston, but you know, we're still finding new places to build parks. A perfect example is the project that the trustees are working on in East Boston, overlooking the harbor. Brian, you want to, you know, share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, and adjacent to that, obviously, you know, Piers Park and Low Presti are just phenomenally well used, right? If you go down there any hour of the day, there's usually a soccer game happening and kids on the playgrounds, and I think so. My lesson learned is that we need to be as strategic and proactive in the planning of our parks as we are with other aspects of development in our cities. And too often, I think, you know, we plan the parks last and we designate the space for the parks last, instead of saying it is such a foundational asset to the vibrancy of any city of any size. You know, we at Arup, we're having the privilege of working with the city of Providence on rethinking Kennedy Plaza and its waterfront to really make it a dynamic use for all of the citizens of Providence, not just a downtown, plaza where folks pick up their bus. And I think so part of it is in, you know, making sure that we are planning the parks for the types of uses and activations that we want to see. And there's a full range. There are places where you're going to want the passive park. You're going to want, the public garden is very different than the commons. And I think, you know, the city of Boston over time said, well, wait a second, if it's a commons, maybe we should be hosting major events here. And look at the success of some of the major concerts that the Commons has brought in, folks that had never come into the Boston Commons before on a night or a weekend, in terms of, you know, Boston Calling and other major events. And we need a mix of green and gray infrastructure to host major events and to activate, right? Every park isn't, you know, a lot of trees and benches. You know, we need to think about the uses, about where are folks going to play soccer, about where are they going to hit a baseball, about, you know, everything from the 2-year-olds uses to the senior citizens uses. And I think if we take the seriousness with the planning of our parks as much as we take the seriousness with our planning of economic development and do them simultaneously, then we wind up with a very different appreciation for the return on investment of those public open spaces than we do now. You know, I'm not a fan on transit or on parks of saying these things should pay for themselves, because these are foundational assets that cause people to want to live and work and play in cities. They drive so much other benefit that, you know, I think it's short-sighted for us to say these should be, revenue neutral types of assets.
David, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think when people think of park, like Brian was saying, and people think of like a green lawn and trees, and I think thinking of it as a public realm, and I think Boston has a great opportunity to redefine its relationship with water. I think a lot of the city, like for example, like you can be walking on the Greenway and you don't know that you're maybe 1 block or 2 blocks away from the water. And I know there are policies in place, but like as we have more opportunities for new development that is going on, I think how do we take open space in the public realm as a top priority of development when it comes to review, but then also as developers, so that we redefine how we interact with the environment. And I think the biggest opportunity for Boston, or biggest area for improvement, it's the relationship with water. I don't know, I have been in Boston maybe 10 years now, and it took me maybe 3 or 4 years to know that Southie had a beach, you know, and and I was like, oh my, like, it's such a great asset. Like, I mean, it just needs some investment, you know, people are still going, but like, it just, yeah, I think it's prioritizing them when it comes to review and development. So yeah, that's kind of my thought.
Emily, what do you think?
I'd agree with Brian, absolutely, that parks are a foundational asset for any community, but especially for a big city. The quote is that the lungs of the city, right? And we've been dancing it around public health a little bit, but certainly parks as place for community building, as places for people to get exercise, to experience the outdoors, to have that range of, you know, you mentioned green and gray infrastructure, Brian. I'd add David's blue infrastructure to that. And especially because so many of our parks are incorporated with land that used to have water running through it. You know, think of the Olmsted parks. How do we think about these places, whether large or small, as really being fundamental rights for the communities? And I pluralize that because of the different neighborhoods throughout Boston. People should have equal access to parks. They should feel equally comfortable in having parks that are safe to be in, that are clean, that are well maintained, that they feel welcome in being, and they should be able to get there easily, whether it's from a quick walk or a bike ride, or you know, I remember when I first started planning, somebody told me, you know, Emily, there's this 5-minute ice cream rule where everybody should be 5 minutes from ice cream. I'd certainly expand that to be everybody should be 5 minutes from a great park, especially in an urbanized area. I think too, with the impacts of climate change, with heat island effect coming in, with the fact that many of our much of our housing stock is outdated in terms of the cooling possibilities in Massachusetts, right? Everything was built to keep us warm rather than to keep us cool. The parks and the green spaces are going to be more important than ever. And so taking this renewed focus on the public realm, a lot of these arguments have percolated down from planning and development circles into everyday conversation. It's a good time for us to be revisiting this fundamental aspect of our cities.
And I think in how you set up the question, John, right? Lawn on D at the beginning was a really risky proposition, right? Is anybody going to go to a park, you know, on the backside of a convention center? I mean, what a phenomenal testament to saying there's just pent up demand for different types of uses of open space in all of our neighborhoods in Boston, right? And you build it and people will come out of the woodwork at all hours of the day for something cool and a new experience, you know, in a public realm, right? Or a quasi public realm in that case.
If I may,
yes, sir.
If I may just add, because remind me of the work that we do, like the importance of also parks from a public health perspective as well, but like for social cohesion, like, I mean, I feel like as urban areas in the United States have been so segregated because of different policies, like finding that common ground or kind of forcing people from different areas to interact, it's crucial. And one thing that I can talk about is that I work in low-income neighborhoods all the time, and this one specifically where we work is that it's just right at the intersection of downtown Salem, this Hispanic community. What we did was we created what now it's called the Punto Urban Art Museum, but we use art in alleys and public areas and around buildings, and all of a sudden become a destination. But for the first time, it was downtown community interacting with the Hispanic community and finding through art a common ground that before it was like, I will never interact because they're just a different background. And so public spaces are key from every angle. So just reinforcing that idea.
The answers to the last question is sort of the theme of equity has come up. I was wondering, since we only have time for one last question, if the panelists can just each address, how do we recover with an eye toward social equity? This is obviously something that policymakers are going to be thinking about. We've talked about how people who can afford to go back to a nice, 2,000 square foot house with a separate home office are better off than the people who have to work from quote unquote home in a giant apartment building. There's also questions of equity. Parks in some neighborhoods are nicer than others. What are your suggestions about how the recovery can be shared by all going forward before we wrap up the panel? You want to start, Brian?
Sure. I think it's a great question, and clearly the pandemic made ever more salient the inequities and the large percentage of the population in Greater Boston and elsewhere and around the country that was highly vulnerable to economic disruption, right? And where we had not built in very much resilience at all societally. And so those who are least able to bear the brunt of an impact of this face the most significant impacts. And so there's an equity standpoint to this, but there's really a fundamental justice question here, right? And so I think I am cautiously optimistic that the tone coming out of Washington and out of a lot of the state governments at this point is to center equity and justice in our reinvestment in our communities, rather than saying, it needs to be proportionate. To solve the injustices of the last several decades of economic and real estate development means that we have to be justice oriented and inequitable in our investment, in the sense of investing more in the communities that we going forward that received less investment in the past, and understanding that that's what it's going to take to benefit everybody, right? And so I think from that standpoint, centering a lot of the centering equity in our downtown planning, centering equity, to David's point about creating public spaces that bring in communities that traditionally had not been designed for or invited into, and saying, we want to invest not only in the locations of those parks, but the types of uses that allow folks to bring in their backgrounds, their cultures, and business opportunities, right? I think in Boston in particular, what it means to be a small and female or minority owned business, and the support that the city needs to give to those is front and center in the public discourse, right? This is not about let's bring in another national retail chain, right? This is about how do we support the rebirth of our downtown main streets in a way that that all of our communities are thriving. So my optimism is based on the attention that it's getting in the discourse. Now we need to put the actual investment dollars behind it, engage communities where they're at, and give them control of the resources coming in federally and statewide to rebuild better and more equitable and more just.
What do you think, Emily?
I think what Brian said about this pandemic really exposing the inequities that we have in our society is critically important. And the question is, okay, now that it's been a topic of conversation that has become more mainstream, what do we do with it? And so absolutely agreed on the small business, the work that the Boston Globe did, the reporting more than a few years back about the inequities in wealth building among the different races and communities, particularly in our area. We need to address that. We need to figure out ways of helping people create wealth. Part of that is through small business. Part of that is by making it easier for people to simply live their lives. And by that, I mean moving away some of the barriers. So getting people good transportation to jobs, providing the resources such as childcare. I remember, this is not a Boston-based one, but I remember reading a few years ago about a woman down in the South who had to travel 2 hours by bus one way to drop her children off at daycare, and travel 3 hours back in the other direction to get to her job. That is not something that should be part of our society. So I think that's part of it. Talking with my dad the other day, who used to work with libraries, and talking about reaching out to multiple cultures, he had a fabulous point on housing, is that many cultures have multi-generational families, and our housing stock's not really well built for that, other than perhaps a 3-decker, which actually is a great model for that. Multi-generations allows for childcare in the home and for people to go out to work. We need to really talk to our communities and listen to them. The city's been doing a great job in recent years for that, but find out what are the barriers to being able to to get to the points where they have the opportunity to take advantage of the access that we give them to build that wealth, to build their communities. And I'll just add one more thing before turning it over to David, because I know we're low on time and he has the most direct experience. But a friend of mine said recently about a design project that we were both involved with, where a lot of the options that were given for the lower income communities were very temporary. And she said, you know, low income communities deserve great design and great solutions just as much as higher income communities do. And I think sometimes we forget that, and that needs to come to the forefront. Let's put our best talents in design of systems as well as places to those communities and really invest in them.
Great. David, you have the final word on this one.
Yes, no, I think Brian said a word that I really like, because there's 1,000 words to reward that, but like realizing that you got to invest inequitably, and that means invest more in those areas that have been disprivileged for so long. A second thing is education. I think education is critical, and always, and I think there is an educational component, not just for the people that have been disinvested for years, but also for the people that have had the privilege of being educated, is that there is a reflection that we're all part of that issue. So as individuals, we have to reflect on like what's the part that we play. And as we provide educational tours in our Urban Art Museum, that's what we try to do. It's like, as all these schools come and learn, it's more like, how do you reflect upon your role in society? And hopefully through education and investment, multifaceted approach, we will get there, so.
Great. Well, thanks to everyone for tuning in. Thanks to the panelists for sharing their insight. This was certainly helpful for me, and I'm sure I'll be picking their brains in the future as I write stories about all these topics. So I hope we can all stay in touch and have a great day and enjoy the spring sunshine. It's finally